In the middle of the 19th century, at a time when the United States was transforming from a young republic into an expanding industrial power, there was a place in New York City that captured both the imagination and the fear of an entire nation. It was situated in Lower Manhattan, only a short walk from the city's bustling harbor, where ships arrived daily carrying thousands of immigrants, hopeful and weary, longing for a fresh start. But just beyond that harbor, past the towering masts and through streets that grew narrower and darker with every step, there lay a neighborhood that would soon become infamous in newspapers, novels, and political debates. That place was the Five Points. To step into the 5 points of the 1,850 was to enter a world that existed almost outside the boundaries of ordinary American life. It was a place where different cultures collided at every intersection, where poverty and opportunity mingled in unpredictable ways, and where survival itself was an achievement earned day by day. Travelers who wandered into the district often wrote that it felt as if they had crossed from the bright, ambitious America they knew into a shadowy underworld, one that was not hidden, but unmistakably alive and pulsing. And yet, this place was not isolated from the rest of the city. The wealthy lived only blocks away. The city's courts, markets, and banks were within walking distance. The 5 Points was both close to the heart of New York and far removed from its ideals. As you approached the neighborhood in 1,850, the first thing you noticed was the noise. It was constant, layered, and unruly. Carriages rattling over uneven stones, street vendors shouting their prices, children laughing, crying, or running through alleys in small packs, musicians playing jigs or rhythms from distant homelands, and the unsteady footsteps of drunken men staggering toward dimly lit taverns. Above all of it was the low, restless hum of thousands of people packed into a small space, each with their own struggles, frustrations, and dreams. Some newcomers described the sound as a roar, others as a restless breathing, as if the neighborhood itself were a living organism with a pulse that never stopped. The air carried a distinct mixture of scents, some familiar and others unsettling. There was the smell of fresh bread from immigrant bakeries, fish frying on corner stalls, and tobacco smoke drifting from doorways. But mingled with these were far less pleasant odors, the dampness rising from cellars that never fully dried, the sewage that overflowed during heavy rains, the decay of rotting wood and refuse piled in gutters, and the foul stench from overcrowded lodging houses where dozens of bodies slept in the same cramped rooms. For many who passed through, this combination of aromas stayed with them long after they left, becoming part of their memory of New York in the era of mass immigration. The 5 Points did not earn its reputation solely from poverty or disorder. What made it unique, even astonishing for its time, was its diversity. Standing at a crossroads in the heart of the neighborhood, you would see people from countries many Americans had never encountered before. The Irish were the largest group in the 1,850s, driven out of their homeland by the Great Famine. They arrived sick, hungry, and desperate, taking whatever shelter they could find, often in the cheapest and most neglected buildings. But they were not alone. African-American families, some freeborn, others recently emancipated, lived alongside German tradesmen, Italian street performers, Chinese laborers, Jewish peddlers from Eastern Europe, and Caribbean sailors who had decided to settle permanently in the city. It was a human mosaic unlike anything most Americans had ever seen. This blend of cultures created a sense of energy and unpredictability. At any moment, you might hear Irish Gaelic spoken beside African musical rhythms, or German phrases shouted across the street toward Italian shopkeepers. Outsiders who visited the area didn't always know how to react. Some saw it as dangerous, chaotic, even frightening. Others saw it as a symbol of what America was becoming: messy, diverse, evolving, and full of possibility. But for those who lived there, it was simply home. To truly understand the 5 points of the 1850s, one must imagine the daily challenges that shaped life within it. The neighborhood was built over a section of land that had once been a pond, drained poorly and unevenly, leaving the ground unstable and perpetually wet. The streets dipped and sloped unpredictably, pooling with muddy water that never fully evaporated. During heavy rains, basements flooded, carrying with them the filth of the streets. Tenements sank gradually into the soft earth, causing walls to tilt, floors to sag, and roofs to leak. Families living inside these buildings felt the instability under their feet as they walked, sometimes needing to balance against walls to stay upright. And yet, these dilapidated structures were always full. In some rooms, entire families lived in spaces no larger than a modern kitchen. In others, lodgers who barely knew each other shared a single bed by sleeping in shifts, one person resting while another worked or wandered the streets. Those who could not afford even this arrangement paid a few cents to sleep on the floor, on stairwells, or simply sitting upright against a wall. The idea of privacy was almost non-existent. Thin wooden walls separated households, and voices, arguments, laughter, and cries flowed freely from room to room. Despite these harsh conditions, the 5 Points had an undeniable sense of vibrancy. The streets were alive with activity from dawn until long past midnight. Children sprinted between buildings, dodging carts and shouting greetings to neighbors. Women hung laundry from windows, calling down to friends or bargaining with merchants below. Men stood outside taverns or workshops, discussing politics, sharing news from their homelands, or arguing about wages. Street vendors sold everything from oysters and boiled corn to old clothes and trinkets. The sound of hammers striking metal rang from makeshift blacksmith stalls, while fiddlers played lively tunes to earn a few coins from passers-by. Visitors often remarked on how quickly the neighborhood transformed from one moment to the next. In the morning, the streets buzzed with workers preparing for the day. By noon, crowds of children, merchants, and laborers filled the roads, and by night, the area took on a different, more dangerous character. Shadows lengthened across narrow alleys, candles flickered behind broken windows, and the glow of taverns spilled onto the streets as their doors swung open. Groups of young men roamed in clusters, some simply enjoying the evening, others seeking trouble. The line between entertainment and violence was thin, and it was not uncommon for arguments to escalate into fights within seconds. But this was also a place where hope lived stubbornly, refusing to be extinguished by hardship. Many who arrived here came with nothing but determination. They searched for work relentlessly, saved every coin they could, and dreamed of eventually moving their families to better neighborhoods. For them, the 5 Points was not the end of their journey, but the beginning. It was the first foothold in a new country where opportunity was unpredictable but still possible. Within these overcrowded streets, fortunes rose and fell quickly. Some individuals who arrived with only the clothes on their backs eventually opened small businesses, found stable employment, or established new community networks that helped later immigrants. Others struggled for years, barely scraping by, living on the edge of bankruptcy, illness, or homelessness. Newspapers of the time loved to sensationalize the 5 Points. They described it as a place filled with vice and danger, where crime lurked behind every corner and morality was in short supply. Some reports were exaggerated, written to shock readers and sell papers. But others contained painful truths. Violence was common, illness spread rapidly, and crimes ranging from petty theft to serious assaults occurred frequently. For residents, this was simply part of daily life. They learned to navigate their environment with caution, instinctively recognizing which streets to avoid at night and which individuals to steer clear of. Still, the neighborhood was not defined solely by its problems. It was also a place of innovation and cultural exchange. Dance halls offered lively entertainment where Irish step dancing mixed with African American footwork, creating new styles that would influence American music and dance for generations. Churches and charity organizations set up missions and schools, offering education and support to families trying to rise above their circumstances. Immigrant societies formed mutual aid groups, providing financial help, funeral services, and a sense of belonging to newcomers who felt lost in a strange land. Those who came to study or reform the neighborhood often left with complicated impressions. Some saw only the misery and degradation, concluding that the 5 Points was a stain on the growing city. Others, however, noticed the resilience and strength of its residents, their ability to adapt, endure, and create community despite overwhelming odds. They saw mothers who worked tirelessly to feed their children, fathers who labored long hours in dangerous jobs, and neighbors who supported each other during sickness or hardship. They witnessed friendships forming across cultural lines, something rare in the rest of the country at the time. One of the most remarkable aspects of the 5 Points was the coexistence of such diversity in an era when racial and ethnic divisions were stark elsewhere. In many American cities, communities were segregated by nationality or color. But here, out of necessity and circumstance, people lived side by side. African American families shared buildings with Irish immigrants. German and Jewish newcomers traded with Italian vendors. Caribbean sailors dined beside Chinese laborers at street stalls. While tensions and conflicts certainly existed, these interactions also created new cultural blends that enriched the broader American identity. Nighttime in the 5 Points brought a different atmosphere altogether, one that fascinated outsiders and even lured curious visitors from wealthier parts of the city. Gas lamps flickered along the streets, casting long, wavering shadows. Music spilled out from taverns where patrons danced, argued, or drank to forget their troubles. Street performers gathered small crowds by demonstrating feats of agility, singing songs, or playing home-made instruments. Fortune tellers whispered predictions to clients, while gamblers huddled around makeshift tables, their eyes shifting anxiously between the cards and the entrance. The district was alive in a way that felt both thrilling and unsettling, filled with possibilities but shadowed by risk. Many who passed through at night felt torn between fascination and caution. They were drawn to the energy, the unpredictability, the sense that life here was raw and unfiltered. But they were also aware of the dangers, pickpockets, brawls, and sudden outbreaks of violence that could erupt without warning. Yet, for many residents, this was simply another part of life. They grew accustomed to the noise, the occasional chaos, and the constant motion of the streets. The 5 Points of the 1850s was often spoken about as if it were a single, unified place, but in reality it was a complex patchwork of experiences. For some, it was a temporary stop on the path to a better future. For others, it was a long-term home shaped by familiarity and community ties. For a few, it became a trap from which escape seemed nearly impossible. The neighborhood was shaped by forces larger than any one individual: immigration, economic change, political corruption, and urban development. Yet the daily lives of its residents were shaped by small, personal struggles: finding enough food, securing a day's wages, protecting children from illness, or maintaining hope in a harsh environment. Despite its challenges, the 5 points became a symbol of something uniquely American. It represented the messy, chaotic birth of the modern city. It reflected the struggle of newcomers trying to build lives in a land that promised opportunity but offered no guarantees. And it revealed the ways in which diverse communities could coexist, influence each other, and contribute to a shared cultural landscape. Those who lived in the 5 points did not think of themselves as historical figures. They were simply people trying to survive, to find moments of joy amid hardship, and to carve out a place in a rapidly changing world. But their experiences, recorded in letters, newspaper articles, reformer journals, and government reports, paint a vivid picture of what life was truly like in one of the most notorious neighborhoods of its time. The 5 points was a paradox, dangerous yet vibrant, impoverished yet full of potential, chaotic yet deeply human. It was a place that outsiders judged harshly, but insiders understood intimately. And in the 1850s, at the height of its fame and its infamy, it stood as a living representation of the struggles and aspirations that defined an era. As you move deeper into the 5 points of the 1850s, the transformation happens gradually, almost imperceptibly at first. The wide, structured streets of Manhattan begin to narrow. The buildings, once evenly spaced and upright, seem to press inward as if exhausted by the weight of time and neglect. The atmosphere thickens. The noise grows louder, and suddenly you find yourself in a place that feels unlike any other neighborhood in America, dense, chaotic, crumbling, alive. It is a world shaped not only by the people who inhabit it, but by the land beneath it, a land that never truly wanted to be a neighborhood in the first place. To understand 5 points, one must begin with the ground itself. Long before the tenements, before the gangs, before the overcrowded streets, there was a body of water called the Collect Pond. It was once beautiful, deep, cool, and clean, lying drinking water to the early city. Families picnicked on its banks, children played at its edges. But as New York grew, tanneries, slaughterhouses, and factories sprang up around its shorelines, dumping waste into the once clear pond until it became a foul, smelling stew. When the pond became too polluted to salvage, the city drained it, filled it with earth, and tried to build on top of it. But the earth never settled properly. This single decision, to bury water rather than reshape land, created the foundation for one of the most notorious slums in American history. By the 1850s, the ground beneath 5 points had become permanently unstable. Buildings sank unevenly, tilting at strange angles. Streets buckled and dipped unpredictably. Moisture seeped upward from the buried pond, saturating soil and walls, creeping into basements that were often little more than muddy pits. On hot days, the smell rising from the ground was overwhelming, a reminder that the earth below was still decomposing, still shifting, still fighting against the weight of the city above. Walking through the streets, you could feel this instability underfoot. Wooden planks laid across flooded alleys shook with each step. Cobblestones tilted, causing carts to wobble. Water pooled in every depression, forming stagnant puddles that reflected the dim light filtering between tightly spaced buildings. Even in dry weather, the streets were damp. In rainy seasons, some areas were nearly impassable. The buildings rising from this unsteady terrain were as unpredictable as the ground itself. Some leaned noticeably to one side, requiring residents to brace themselves or walk at odd angles inside their own homes. Others sagged inward in the middle, their floors shaped like shallow bowls. Doors didn't close properly. Windows were crooked in their frames. Wooden stairs creaked, shifted, or buckled under weight. Tenants joked grimly that if you dropped a coin on the floor, you never knew which direction it would roll. A few structures seemed held up only by the buildings beside them, forming clusters of teetering, interdependent dwellings. These structures were not merely old, they were overwhelmed. Families lived in rooms designed for one or two people. Hallways doubled as sleeping areas. Attics were packed with makeshift mattresses or piles of cloth. Basement rooms, often only partially above ground level, were perpetually dark, musty, and wet. During storms, water seeped through walls and floors, turning living spaces into muddy traps. Residents used buckets to collect dripping water, cloth to plug leaks, and boards to elevate their beds above the damp. Ventilation was minimal. Many rooms had no windows at all. Others had windows that opened onto air shafts so narrow and clogged with debris that barely any breeze entered. In summer, heat collected inside, making rooms stifling and nearly airless. In winter, drafts cut through cracks in the walls, chilling families who lacked proper clothing or insulation. The darkness in some rooms was so complete that people lit candles throughout the day. The overcrowding was staggering. Census reports, though often inaccurate, suggest that some buildings housed more people than entire rural towns. A single tenement might contain 50, 70, or even more than 100 residents. Whole blocks were packed with human beings living shoulder to shoulder, sharing narrow stairways, flimsy doors, and communal sinks that rarely worked. This density shaped every aspect of daily life. Privacy was non-existent. Neighbors heard every argument, every lullaby, every moment of grief or laughter. Smells of cooking, sweat, sickness, and unwashed clothing intertwined in the air. The sound of crying babies mixed with the clatter of pots and pans, the rasping coughs of sick residents, the shouts of street vendors, and the endless chatter of people trying to make sense of their lives. Outside, the streets formed a maze of narrow passages, crooked intersections, and irregular pathways. The layout of 5 points was confusing even to those who lived there. Buildings were added haphazardly over time. Extensions were built onto existing structures with little regard for safety or symmetry. Some alleyways stopped abruptly, blocked by buildings added later. Others twisted unexpectedly, opening into small courtyards filled with laundry lines, barrels of rainwater, or makeshift stalls. The most notorious intersection, the true 5 points, was where Anthony Street, Baxter Street, and Park Street converged. Outsiders often imagined this intersection as the eye of a storm, the very center of the neighborhood's reputation. It was a place of constant motion. Carts rattled through, vendors set up stalls, children gathered to play, gangs sometimes faced off here. Police officers passed through reluctantly, often in pairs or groups. Missionaries preached on corners, drunks staggered past, mothers hurried home with baskets of food. It was a crossroads of poverty, commerce, danger, and survival. At almost any hour, music echoed from windows or street performers. Fiddles played Irish reels. African-American musicians beat rhythms on makeshift drums, crates, or even spoons. Occasionally, a small crowd would gather to watch impromptu dancing, footwork that blended traditions from different cultures, creating something uniquely American. The noise level was astonishing. Residents grew accustomed to falling asleep to the sounds of shouting, singing, arguments, or footsteps. Newcomers often described their first nights as sleepless ordeals, overwhelmed by the constant clamor. While other parts of the city quieted after dark, the 5 points came alive with energy that persisted long into the night. Street vendors were everywhere, selling goods from wooden carts or crates balanced on stools. Their voices rose in a chorus of competing cries. The fish seller calling out prices, the baker advertising fresh loaves, the rag dealer offering to buy old clothing. The newsboy shouting headlines about murders, political scandals, or fires. Many residents relied on these street markets, unable to afford shop-front goods. Children played a major role in this economy. Even very young children, some no older than 4 or 5, were sent into the streets to sell matches, flowers, newspapers, or candies. They navigated the crowded roads with remarkable skill, calling out to potential customers, dodging carts and horses, learning quickly how to survive in a world that offered little protection. The condition of the streets themselves contributed to the difficulty of daily life. Garbage piled up faster than city workers could remove it. Food scraps, broken glass, animal waste, and discarded objects formed layers that residents sometimes had no choice but to walk through. Rats were common. Stray dogs roamed freely. In the warmer months, the smell was overpowering, especially near the open drains that often overflowed. Sewage was a constant problem. Streets simply weren't designed to support such a dense population. In some areas, gutters overflowed into the road, creating narrow rivulets of foul-smelling water. Children splashed through these without shoes. Adults stepped carefully or walked on elevated planks. During storms, the situation worsened dramatically. Floodwater mixed with waste, filling basements and forcing residents to wade through polluted water to reach their homes. Despite these conditions, life continued. Residents adapted in countless small ways. They hung stones from laundry lines to keep clothes from dipping into filthy puddles. They placed cloth under doors to block drafts or smells. They used old furniture to create walkways across muddy courtyards. They memorized routes to avoid the worst areas, but the neighborhood's physical conditions also bred danger. Fire was an ever-present threat. Buildings were made of wood, crowded close together, and often equipped with old or makeshift stoves. A single fire could spread rapidly, trapping residents in upper floors or narrow stairwells. Accidents were common. Newspapers reported occasional tragedies. Families burned alive, children suffocated by smoke, entire blocks reduced to smoldering ruins. Police presence was inconsistent. Officers rarely patrolled alone. Many viewed the area with suspicion or fear. Political corruption also influenced policing, as some officers were instructed to ignore certain activities or look the other way when dealing with gangs aligned with powerful political figures. This contributed to the neighborhood's reputation for lawlessness, though in truth, many residents simply sought to live quietly despite their surroundings. One of the defining characteristics of the 5 Points, something impossible to ignore, was the stark contrast between the neighborhood and the rest of the city. Only a short distance away, well-dressed businessmen entered elegant buildings. Wealthy families strolled through parks. Carriages rolled down broad, clean streets. Visitors often expressed disbelief that such extreme poverty existed so close to so much wealth. Writers, reformers, and curious tourists came to observe the neighborhood firsthand. Some were horrified, describing it as a place filled with vice and squalor. Others were captivated by its vitality, seeing in its crowded streets a reflection of America's diversity and ambition. A few attempted to help directly, establishing schools, missions, and charity organizations. Their experiences varied. Some found a warm reception, others encountered suspicion, frustration, or danger. Yet no matter how the outside world viewed it, the physical world of the 5 Points shaped its people in profound ways. The crumbling buildings, uneven streets, damp walls, and constant noise created an environment where adaptability was essential. A person living here needed to be alert, resilient, resourceful, and quick-thinking. The neighborhood demanded strength not because its residents were weak, but because survival depended on it. Every corner, every building, every crooked alley whispered stories. Stories of families trying to make a living. Stories of immigrants searching for hope. Stories of conflicts born from overcrowding, poverty, and cultural differences. Stories of unexpected friendships formed in cramped courtyards and stairwells. Stories of laughter shared on stoops despite everything. Stories of sorrow, loss, perseverance, and dreams that refused to fade. This physical world, the carriages rolling through muddy streets, the sagging tenements stacked with lives, the echoes of music and arguments, the mix of scents, the unending movement, was the stage upon which the drama of 5 Points unfolded. It was a world that shaped everyone who entered it. Some left quickly, others stayed for years, but no one passed through unchanged. 5 Points was not merely a neighborhood. It was a living, breathing entity, shaped by the land below and the people above, imperfect and unpredictable, but undeniably alive. And in the 1850s, it stood as one of the most intense and extraordinary environments in the growing mosaic of America. The 5 Points in the 1850s was a place where daily life unfolded on a razor's edge, where survival often depended on the ability to adapt to chaos, danger, and crushing poverty. If you walked its streets at dawn, you would already see movement. Children with soot-stained faces running errands, women carrying pails of water, men stumbling home from all-night taverns. The air held a mix of wood smoke, alcohol, rotting vegetables, manure, and sweat. The alleys were narrow, the tenements overcrowded, and the people were exhausted from nights that never truly offered rest. In many ways, the 5 Points was less a neighborhood and more a living organism, breathing, sweating, groaning, and pulsing with constant, unpredictable energy. Life in the tenements was a battle against both physical deterioration and emotional strain. These buildings, originally designed as respectable homes for middle-class families, had been gutted and divided into cramped rooms that often lacked proper ventilation, sanitation, or even natural light. A single building could hold hundreds of people, each room sheltering multiple families. Some residents lived in cellars so damp that fungus crept up the walls. Others lived in windowless interior rooms where the air seemed to sit, thick and stale, until someone opened a hallway door. The floors creaked, the walls were thin, and privacy was a luxury almost nobody could afford. Arguments, crying babies, drunken singing, and coughing from disease-ridden residents all blended into a constant symphony of noise. If you lived there, you learned quickly that the thin walls and shared hallways meant everyone knew everything about everyone. A fight 2 rooms away was as audible as if it were next door. A whispered conversation between a wife and husband could accidentally travel to half the building. There was a strange intimacy to this forced closeness. Neighbors could become like family or bitter rivals depending on how stress shaped their relationships. When illness struck, sometimes a neighbor would bring broth or help fetch a doctor. Other times, fear of contagion had people barricading their rooms and refusing to open the door. Most families slept on straw mattresses or piles of old cloth arranged on wooden pallets. In the coldest months, frost sometimes formed on the inside walls of poorly insulated rooms, and coal or wood to heat the stove was often too expensive to use generously. People slept close together to conserve warmth. In summer, the heat inside the tenements grew so unbearable that residents spilled into the streets, sleeping on stoops or sidewalks, hoping for a breeze. But outside, too, life came with danger. Thieves, drunks, and gangs roamed freely at night. Yet people still chose the streets over suffocating heat, accepting potential harm because the alternative meant sleepless misery. Food was a daily challenge. Proper meals were rare, especially for the poorest families. At the markets, vendors sold bruised vegetables, leftovers from wealthier neighborhoods, or meat approaching spoilage, cheap enough for struggling families but risky to eat. Bread was the staple of life, sometimes hard and stale by the time it reached 5 points. Children learned early to stretch meals, watery soups made from a few potatoes, bits of cabbage, or bones reused multiple times. Meat was an occasional luxury. Even when families could afford it, they were often buying the lowest quality cuts. Some residents scavenged through trash disposed of by hotels or restaurants in the more prosperous parts of Manhattan, looking for scraps. A person's survival depended not only on money, but on ingenuity, using what little they had and wasting nothing. Water, often taken for granted today, was another serious problem. Most buildings lacked indoor plumbing, and clean water was not always accessible. Residents relied on public pumps, some of which delivered water contaminated with sewage or industrial runoff. Families boiled water whenever possible, but coal and wood weren't cheap. Children were often sent with buckets to fill, sometimes waiting in long lines. During epidemics, fear lingered around the pumps as people believed, correctly, though without scientific knowledge, that contaminated water could bring disease. Still, they had no choice but to drink it, cook with it, and wash with it. Bathing was infrequent simply because it was so difficult to manage. Disease thrived in these conditions. Tuberculosis, cholera, typhus, and diphtheria were common. Coughing was a constant background noise in the tenements, and funerals were a familiar sight. Many children did not survive past early childhood. Parents lived with the dread of losing their children to sickness or malnutrition, yet they limited their grief because mourning could consume a person already struggling to make ends meet. Doctors were expensive, hospitals were distrusted, and many relied on home remedies passed down through generations. Some of these remedies helped, many did not. Life expectancy was low, especially among the poorest. Yet despite this harsh reality, the 5 Points was not a place without joy or humanity. People found ways to create moments of brightness amid the gloom. Music drifted from taverns or spilled from tenement windows where someone might be playing a fiddle. Irish immigrants brought their traditional songs, often accompanied by lively footwork that echoed on wooden floors. African-American residents added their own rhythms and dances, blending traditions in ways that would later influence American music itself. Even in poverty, people celebrated weddings, births, and religious holidays. These celebrations, though modest, allowed residents to forget their hardships for a brief time. Children, especially, managed to carve out joy despite living in one of the roughest environments in the country. They played stickball in alleys, chased each other through crowded markets, and splashed in puddles after rainstorms. They created games out of whatever scraps they found: buttons, stones, bits of wood. Many children, however, worked from a young age. Newsboys sold papers in loud, competitive groups. Others shined shoes, carried packages, or ran errands for pennies. Some swept floors in saloons or helped their parents with piecework. Childhood innocence didn't last long. Most kids knew the weight of responsibility far earlier than wealthier children in other parts of the city. Women shouldered enormous burdens in the 5 Points. In many families, they managed the household while also finding ways to earn money. Some took in laundry, scrubbing garments in cold water until their fingers cracked. Others sewed or mended clothing, a task that required long hours for little pay. In mixed ethnic neighborhoods, women sometimes learned enough of each other's languages to negotiate prices, ask for help, or share information. Domestic labor was relentless: cooking, cleaning, caring for children, dealing with sickness. Women often stretched themselves beyond their limits, sometimes taking dangerous jobs in sweatshops just to keep the family afloat. Many endured harsh conditions quietly, knowing their families depended on them. Men, meanwhile, faced a different set of pressures. Many worked as laborers on docks, in factories, or on construction sites. These jobs were grueling and dangerous. One wrong move with machinery could lead to injury or death. Some found work digging sewers or laying bricks, while others unloaded ships or pushed carts through the streets. The work was unstable. On days when no jobs were available, men returned home with empty pockets and heavy spirits. The resulting frustration sometimes led to alcoholism, a major problem in the neighborhood. Saloons became places where men gathered to forget their troubles, but excessive drinking also worsened family tensions. Still, many men tried to better their situations. They attended meetings led by reformers, sought apprenticeships when possible, or learned new skills. Some became barbers, shoemakers, or small shop owners. Others joined benevolent societies formed by immigrant groups to support their members through financial struggles, illness, or burial costs. These micro-communities offered a sense of dignity and belonging that life in the 5 points often stripped away. The streets themselves were a world of constant activity. Vendors shouted prices for fish, bread, fruit, or cheap trinkets. Peddlers pushed carts with everything from used shoes to old pots. Street performers entertained crowds with juggling, dancing, or music. Some were genuinely talented, others simply hoped for a few coins. Beggars, too, were common, some disabled, some elderly, others simply unable to find work. Children darted between adults, trying to sell small goods or asking for spare change. The streets were also where residents encountered outsiders who came to gawk at the neighborhood's reputation. Curious visitors, shocked by what they saw, often left with exaggerated stories that further fueled 5 points infamy. Crime was a reality people lived with daily, not always as perpetrators, but often as witnesses or victims. Pickpockets lurked in crowds, waiting for distracted victims. Burglars targeted tenements, knowing that locks were flimsy or non-existent. Many residents learned to guard what little they had, hiding valuables or sleeping lightly at night. But it is important to understand that the majority of people in 5 points were not criminals. They were simply poor, working, struggling individuals trying to live their lives in a difficult environment. Yet the few gangs and criminals who operated in the area cast long shadows, giving the neighborhood a reputation it never fully managed to shake. Walking through the area at any hour meant passing people of diverse backgrounds. This cultural mixture created tension, but also encouraged a fascinating exchange of customs and languages. Irish immigrants lived next to African American families, German newcomers, Jewish peddlers, and Chinese laborers. People heard multiple languages on a single street corner. Religious institutions, Catholic churches, Protestant missions, and African American congregations offered both spiritual guidance and social support. They hosted soup kitchens, literacy classes, and lectures aimed at improving residents' lives. These organizations were often lifelines for families struggling with extreme poverty. Despite these efforts, the environment remained unforgiving. Fires broke out frequently due to unsafe cooking stoves, flammable building materials, and densely packed structures. When a fire erupted, panic spread quickly. Firefighters rushed in, but the narrow streets and crowded buildings made their work nearly impossible. Residents carried whatever possessions they could salvage, while neighbors helped one another escape the smoke. These moments revealed both the fragility of life in 5 points and the resilience of those who lived there. The constant influx of immigrants kept the neighborhood in a state of flux. Newcomers struggled to find their place. They relied on relatives, ethnic associations, or neighbors from their home countries to guide them. As fresh waves arrive, Irish fleeing famine, Germans fleeing political upheaval, African Americans escaping the oppressive conditions of the South. The neighborhood expanded beyond its limits. Tenements became even more crowded, jobs scarcer, and tensions higher. Still, the sense of shared struggle often united people across cultural lines. They recognized that they were all part of a larger fight to survive and build a future in America. Politicians and reformers frequently visited Five Points, though their motives varied. Some wanted to help, others sought votes or wished to use the area's misery to push political agendas. Reformers documented the living conditions, hoping to inspire change. Some took photographs, others wrote detailed reports. Their work eventually contributed to housing reforms in the later 19th century, but in the 1850s, progress was slow. Residents continued to live in cramped spaces, work long hours, and fight against disease and poverty. Many waited for improvements that would take decades to arrive. Yet, even amid all this hardship, the Five Points also served as the birthplace of cultural transformations. African American and Irish residents blended dance styles, creating the early roots of tap dance. Music from various backgrounds merged to form new rhythms. Storytelling, folk traditions, and oral histories flourished in tenements, passed from one generation to the next. These cultural exchanges helped shape the future of American art, music, and entertainment. It was a reminder that even in places of severe hardship, creativity could flourish. By nightfall, the neighborhood transformed. Torches and oil lamps cast flickering shadows on the streets. Saloons, dance halls, and boarding houses came alive with activity. Workers unwound, families gathered around small stoves, and children fell asleep clutching their siblings. Danger also rose with the darkness. Fights erupted, drunken brawls spilled into the streets, and law enforcement patrolled warily. Yet for many residents, night brought a sense of temporary peace. The heat of the day faded, the world quieted slightly, and people embraced whatever rest they could find before the next day's struggles began again. Life in the Five Points during the 1850s was a constant mix of hardship, resilience, struggle, creativity, community, and survival. The people who lived there were not merely characters in sensational newspaper stories, but real individuals fighting daily to improve their lives. They faced impossible circumstances with determination, forming a community that was messy, flawed, vibrant, and deeply human. Their stories reflect the broader story of America itself, a nation built by ordinary people navigating extraordinary challenges. And in the midst of the dirt, noise, and chaos of Five Points, the foundations of future generations were being laid. Life in the Five Points during the 1850s could not be understood without confronting the environment that swallowed its residents each day. The filth, disease, noise, and constant uncertainty formed a living backdrop that shaped the minds, behaviors, and decisions of every man, woman, and child who called this place home. To walk through the neighborhood was to enter a fragile ecosystem, teetering between collapse and rebirth, a place where misery clung to the air yet human determination never fully vanished. Part 4 dives deeper into that everyday experience, exploring what it truly meant to navigate one of the most notorious neighborhoods in American history. As morning light spilled unevenly across the crooked streets, the Five Points stirred like a restless giant. The sun, when it managed to pierce the layers of grime, covered windows and smoke-soaked air, revealed scenes that could unsettle even seasoned visitors. Street gutters overflowed with the previous night's waste, discarded food, broken bottles, unidentifiable scraps of cloth, and sometimes the stench of human waste washed down from upper floors. Residents, especially children, learned to step carefully, weaving through the maze of debris like acrobats performing a daily ritual. The smell was a constant companion, lingering in every breath and settling into clothing and hair as if refusing to leave. The noise began early. Hawkers raised their voices to advertise bread, fish, or fruit. Horses clattered along uneven cobblestones, pulling wagons overloaded with goods or rubble. Babies cried, dogs barked, and women scolded their children or shouted across rooms, since walls were too thin to muffle even small sounds. A distant argument in a tenement hallway traveled easily into a neighbor's room, while a dropped pot or slammed door became a communal event. Silence was rare, peace was rarer still. Instead, life unfolded against an ever-present symphony of survival. Tenements dominated the landscape. These massive, decaying structures leaned toward each other as if sharing secrets about the lives trapped within them. Many residents described the buildings as living beings, breathing, aching, and groaning under the weight of overcrowding. Hallways were narrow, often lit only by a single oil lamp or a sliver of daylight sneaking through cracks in the boards. The floors sagged from years of neglect, and staircases creaked ominously underfoot, threatening collapse. Residents always walked carefully, mindful that one wrong step could send them crashing through rotten boards. Yet even these dangers became normal, woven into the fabric of daily life. Rooms inside the tenements were little more than makeshift shelters. Families sometimes squeezed 6, 8, or even 10 people into a single space barely large enough for two. There were no closets, no proper kitchens, and often no windows. Cooking was done on small stoves or open flames, which increased the risk of fire. A single pot simmering over weak heat might represent the entire day's meal. Furniture was limited to whatever could be scavenged or constructed from scraps of wood. Some families had only crates or boxes to sit on, with mattresses made from rags or piles of old newspapers. In these rooms, life unfolded in intimate proximity. Children slept next to their parents with barely an inch to spare. Older siblings shared what little space remained. Illness spread like wildfire. If one person caught a fever, it was only a matter of time before the entire household fell sick. The lack of proper ventilation made infections especially dangerous. Residents often woke up coughing, their throats raw from breathing stale, humid air laced with dust and mold. Water was a daily struggle. Residents relied on public pumps, and the quality of water varied dramatically. Some pumps delivered water that smelled faintly of chemicals or sewage. Others produced water cloudy enough to inspire fear even in those ignorant of bacteria or disease. Boiling water was ideal but not always possible. Fuel was expensive and stoves were unreliable. As a result, families consumed water that was unsafe, and the consequences were devastating. Cholera swept through the neighborhood periodically, leaving devastation in its wake. Mothers stood helpless beside children wasting away, unable to afford doctors or medicine. The heartbreaking truth was that many deaths could have been prevented with cleaner living conditions, but the poor had no power to demand change. Food presented similar challenges. The neighborhood markets offered cheap produce and meat, but cheap often meant spoiled or nearly rotten. Vendors sold leftovers from more affluent districts, vegetables bruised beyond recognition, meat cut from the edges of carcasses already on their way to putrefaction, and fish that had sat out too long in the sun. Families took what they could afford, turning questionable ingredients into soups and stews stretched across multiple meals. Some families even picked through garbage piles outside wealthier neighborhoods, searching for scraps tossed away by those who could afford to waste. Hunger was a constant companion, gnawing at residents' insides, shaping their priorities and decisions. women bore an overwhelming share of responsibility for stretching these meager resources. They rose before dawn to wash clothes, sweep floors, prepare food, and tend to children while simultaneously trying to earn money. Laundry work was grueling, scrubbing, boiling, rinsing, and wringing clothes by hand, sometimes in ice cold water. Their hands cracked and bled, but they continued because there was no alternative. Sewing provided another source of income, though it required long hours of tedious labor for very little pay. Some women worked in poorly ventilated rooms, stitching until their eyes watered and their backs throbbed. Others took in boarders, sharing their already cramped spaces with strangers just to afford rent. Men faced their own hardships. The majority worked as laborers, carrying heavy loads, digging trenches, unloading ships at the docks, or performing dangerous tasks in factories with minimal safety measures. Injuries were common. A careless moment could result in crushed fingers, broken bones, or even death. Men who suffered injuries often lost their jobs and found themselves dependent on their families or neighbors for support. Many turned to alcohol to escape the harshness of their reality. Saloons became gathering places where men could drown their worries for a few cents, though alcohol often worsened domestic tensions back home. Children grew up quickly in this environment. They had no choice. Many started working as soon as they could walk confidently. Newsboys screamed headlines on busy corners, trying to outsell competitors. Shoeshiners polished boots for pennies. Some children scavenged through trash for items they could resell, pieces of metal, bottles, cloth scraps. Others worked in factories, performing monotonous tasks in dangerous environments. Childhood, as most people understand it today, barely existed in the 5 points. Instead, children learned the harsh realities of poverty early, becoming miniature adults long before their time. Despite these harsh conditions, community life emerged in surprising ways. Neighbors often shared what little they had, food, clothing, or time. In a world where loneliness could crush the spirit, companionship was vital. Families built networks of trust and mutual support, especially among ethnic groups. Irish families bonded over shared memories of the homeland and mutual experiences of discrimination. African American residents created tight, knit communities that relied on social organizations, churches, and mutual aid societies. Germans brought their own cultural traditions, enriching the neighborhood's identity. Every group contributed something unique to the melting pot of 5 points. Religious institutions played a crucial role as well. Churches offered more than spiritual comfort. They provided food, shelter, education, and guidance. Missions targeted children with literacy classes, hoping to equip them with skills that might offer a path out of poverty. Women's groups organized charity events, distributed clothing, and visited the sick. Even if these efforts barely scratched the surface of the neighborhood's needs, they provided hope and reminded residents that not all of society had turned its back on them. The streets remained the heart of the neighborhood, brimming with energy at all hours. Street performers danced, sang, or played instruments, offering moments of entertainment that lifted spirits, even if only briefly. Irish dancers showcased quick footwork, accompanied by lively fiddle tunes. African American performers brought rhythms that mesmerized crowds and influenced emerging art forms. The fusion of these cultural expressions laid the foundation for new American musical traditions. Onlookers clapped, laughed, and cheered humanity rising above hardship through creativity, but the streets were also where danger lurked. Pickpockets, con artists, and petty thieves were a constant threat. Gangs patrolled certain corners, intimidating residents and extorting money. Police presence was uneven. Officers often avoided the area altogether or entered only in groups. Corruption made matters worse, as some officers accepted bribes from criminals while arresting innocent people simply to meet quotas or earn rewards. Many residents viewed law enforcement with suspicion or outright fear, believing the system was stacked against them. Fire posed yet another threat. Flames spread rapidly through the wooden structures, fueled by overcrowded rooms and careless cooking. When fire broke out, panic swept through the tenements. Families rushed to save loved ones. Neighbors broke down doors to free trapped residents. Firefighters struggled to maneuver through tight alleys, and buckets of water often did little to quell the blaze. Afterward, families sifted through smoldering debris, searching for anything salvageable, a pot, a blanket, or a cherished photograph. Tragedies like these left scars that lasted for years, yet families rebuilt their lives because they had no other choice. Reformers, journalists, and curious visitors frequently entered the 5 Points, hoping to understand or expose its conditions. Some came with genuine intentions to help, documenting their observations in reports that eventually spurred change. Others came simply to satisfy their morbid curiosity, treating the neighborhood like a spectacle. Their presence often made residents feel like animals in a cage, viewed through the distorted lens of outsiders who misunderstood their struggles. Yet the attention also brought pressure on the city to act. Over time, reform movements emerged, focusing on sanitation, housing, and public health. But these changes came slowly, far too slowly for the thousands of residents who suffered daily. The 1850s passed with little immediate improvement. For most, life remained a cycle of labor, exhaustion, worry, and fleeting moments of joy. Still, the neighborhood endured, its people forging new cultural identities and carving out lives amid adversity. Their resilience laid the groundwork for future generations, many of whom would eventually rise out of poverty and contribute to the nation in profound ways. The 5 Points was more than dirt and crime. It was a crucible that tested the strength of human spirit, a place where the poorest fought for survival and dignity. Through the hardships of tenement living, the dangers of disease, the uncertainty of work, and the constant battles with corruption and injustice, the people of the 5 Points learned to persevere. They built communities, preserved cultural traditions, created new forms of art, and shaped a part of American identity that still resonates today. Their story is one of hardship, yes, but also of courage, resilience, and the unbreakable will to endure. By the middle of the 1850s, the 5 Points had developed a reputation that stretched far beyond New York City. Newspapers sensationalized it, reformers warned about it, and curious outsiders whispered its name with a blend of fear and fascination. Yet most Americans only knew the myth of the 5 Points, the tales of crime, filth, vice, and corruption. Few understood the deeper truth. Behind every scandalous rumor and shocking statistic was a human story shaped by forces far larger than the neighborhood itself. Part 5 dives into this broader world, examining how politics, media, reform movements, and outside perceptions shaped life inside the 5 Points. To the average New Yorker living far from the clamor of the neighborhood, the 5 Points was almost symbolic, a reminder of the country's growing tensions, economic inequalities, and demographic shifts. But for the people actually living in those overcrowded tenements, the political climate of the city was not some distant concept. It was a force that shaped their access to jobs, their chances for survival, and even their personal safety. The intersection of politics and poverty played out in the streets every day, often in ways that outsiders struggled to comprehend. Political machines thrived in this environment. Most notorious among them was Tammany Hall, a powerful democratic organization that wielded enormous influence over elections, public services, and city policies. Tammany Hall understood a fundamental truth about democracy in the mid-19th century. Votes were power, and the 5 points, shrouded with recent immigrants, was a goldmine of potential support. Immigrants, especially Irish Catholics, arrived in New York with little money, few connections, and minimal knowledge of American politics. Tammany Hall offered them something rare: help. A bag of coal during winter, a basket of food for a hungry family, assistance finding work, or protection from eviction. These gestures created loyalty, and loyalty translated into votes. To many poor immigrants, Tammany was not merely a corrupt political machine, it was a lifeline. A ward boss might arrange a job on the docks. A district captain might arrive at a tenant's door with groceries. A candidate might attend a local wedding or funeral, showing symbolic solidarity. These acts, even if motivated by self-interest, mattered in a place where government institutions largely ignored the suffering of the poor. At the same time, Tammany exploited this dependence. In exchange for these favors, votes were expected, sometimes demanded. Election days in the 5 points were chaotic. Men were pressured, bribed, or intimidated into voting a certain way. Some even voted multiple times under different names, led by party operatives who knew how to manipulate the system. The political tensions of the era did not stop at the neighborhood's borders. Across the country, debates raged about immigration, slavery, labor, and national identity. Many Americans feared that the surge of Irish Catholic immigrants threatened traditional values and economic stability. Anti-immigrant and anti-Catholic sentiments grew, giving rise to the Know Nothing movement. This movement capitalized on fears of foreign influence, portraying immigrants, especially the Irish, as criminals, alcoholics, or uneducated voters easily controlled by political machines. While largely exaggerated, these stereotypes spread quickly through newspapers, speeches, and political pamphlets. Residents of the 5 points became the living embodiment of these fears. Newspaper articles described the neighborhood as lawless, filthy, and dangerous. Journalists wrote sensational stories of gangs, violence, and vice, often exaggerating or fabricating details to captivate readers. Some reporters visited the area only briefly, if at all, yet claimed to understand its inner workings. The more shocking the story, the more newspapers sold. As a result, the 5 points became infamous not because of what it was, but because of what people imagined it to be. The sensational reporting had real consequences. Middle-class families, frightened by what they read, pressured city officials to clean up the neighborhood. Reform organizations mobilized volunteers and funds to investigate the living condition. Religious missionaries descended upon the area, determined to convert, educate, and civilize the residents. While some reformers had good intentions, many viewed the residents as morally inferior, victims of their own supposed shortcomings. They saw poverty as a moral failing rather than a consequence of systemic challenges. These attitudes led to paternalistic solutions that often ignored the residents' real needs. One of the most influential figures to visit the 5 points during this time was Jacob Riis, though he would rise to prominence decades later. His writings and photographs would expose the shocking conditions of New York's poorest neighborhoods, including the 5 points. But in the 1850s, another figure captured the public imagination, the British author Charles Dickens. In 1842, Dickens visited the 5 points during his tour of America and was appalled by what he saw. His widely read account further cemented the neighborhood's notorious reputation. To a global audience, Dickens painted a picture of unimaginable squalor, a place where human beings appeared almost crushed by their environment. His descriptions shocked readers and sparked debates both in America and abroad. These external portrayals created a narrative that overshadowed the daily realities of the residents. They were seen not as individuals, workers, parents, children, but as symbols of urban decay. This dehumanization made it easier for the wealthy to blame the poor for their own suffering rather than confront the structural issues that created such dire conditions. And yet, despite the harsh judgments and misunderstandings, the people of the 5 Points continued to persevere, building lives and communities in the face of overwhelming prejudice. Reformers did bring some positive changes. Some established schools and orphanages, offering children opportunities that their parents never had. They opened soup kitchens, distributing food and clothing to families in need. They pushed for improved sanitation and housing regulations, which eventually led to the demolition of some of the worst tenements. Yet even these improvements came with a cost. When buildings were demolished, residents were often displaced without alternative housing options. With nowhere else to go, many moved into other overcrowded areas, spreading poverty rather than alleviating it. The arrival of the Metropolitan Police in the 1850s marked another turning point. Before their formation, local constables lacked resources and were often deeply entangled in political corruption. Street gangs frequently clashed with law enforcement, and officers patrolled the area reluctantly, if at all. The new police force sought to impose order but struggled against the chaotic nature of the neighborhood. Some officers upheld their duties honorably, risking their lives to protect residents. Others exploited their authority, using excessive force or accepting bribes. Trust between residents and police was fragile, fractured by years of distrust and abuse. Amid this atmosphere of political turmoil and social upheaval, cultural mixing continued to flourish. The neighborhood's reputation for crime overshadowed one of its most important contributions to American culture, the blending of African American and Irish traditions. In dance halls and saloons, African American rhythms met Irish step dancing, giving birth to early forms of tap dance. Musicians experimented with new combinations of instruments and styles, laying the groundwork for later musical innovations. These cultural exchanges were not always harmonious. Tensions between ethnic groups ran high, but they created new expressions of identity that would shape American culture for generations. Religious life played a significant role in shaping the moral and social landscape as well. Catholic parishes offered spiritual refuge to Irish immigrants coping with discrimination and loss. African American churches fostered a powerful sense of community and resilience. Protestant missions worked tirelessly, though sometimes condescendingly, to reform the area. These institutions provided more than worship. They were centers of education, social support, and leadership. They encouraged sobriety, discipline, and solidarity in an environment where despair could easily take root. Still, the weight of poverty was constant. The political conflicts swirling around the 5 Points could not erase the lived experience of families struggling to keep a roof over their heads. Tenants lived in fear of eviction, especially during economic downturns. Landlords rarely made repairs, leaving families to deal with leaks, drafts, infestations, and crumbling walls. Some landlords, driven by greed, raised rents even as conditions deteriorated. Reformers blamed the tenants for the filth, but the truth was that residents lacked the tools, resources, and authority to maintain the buildings. They were renters, not owners, denied control over their environment yet blamed for its decay. Even when reforms were introduced, change came slowly. The city lacked the infrastructure and political will to address poverty effectively. Most reforms were piecemeal, addressing symptoms rather than causes. Efforts to clean the streets or improve sanitation were quickly undermined by overcrowding and limited resources. Attempts to curb crime failed to address the root causes of desperation. Political promises went unfulfilled, and newspaper articles highlighting the neighborhood's failings often did more harm than good. Yet through all this, the people of the 5 Points demonstrated remarkable resilience. They formed mutual aid societies to support each other during illness or unemployment. They organized community gatherings, weddings, funerals, and celebrations that brought moments of joy. They preserved cultural traditions, passing songs, dances, stories, and recipes from one generation to the next. They built relationships across cultural lines, fostering a level of diversity and cooperation that was rare in other parts of the country. This resilience did not erase the hardships, but it defined the spirit of the neighborhood more accurately than the sensational headlines. The 5 Points was not simply a den of crime or a symbol of urban decay. It was a community struggling against overwhelming odds, shaped by a convergence of global forces: immigration, political conflict, economic inequality, and cultural transformation. It was a place where the poorest fought for dignity, opportunity, and survival. Its story is not a tale of failure, but of endurance. By the end of the 1850s, the neighborhood was changing. The Civil War was approaching, bringing new challenges and opportunities. Reform movements grew stronger. Demolition projects began slowly reshaping the landscape, but the heart of the 5 Points, its people, remained. They continued to navigate a world shaped by politics, prejudice, poverty, and hope. Their experiences reflected the struggles of countless immigrants and laborers who helped build the foundations of modern America. The 5 Points may no longer exist on today's maps, but its legacy lives on in the cultural, political, and social DNA of the nation. It was a place where the marginalized built communities, where the oppressed fought for recognition, where new forms of music and dance emerged from shared struggle, and where the democratic experiment was tested daily in the most unlikely of environments. The residents of the 5 Points shaped America as surely as America shaped them. Disease was not just an occasional visitor in the 5 Points. It was a constant companion, an invisible resident living in the water, the walls, the very air itself. Anyone walking through the neighborhood in the early mornings of the 1850s would feel it before they even saw it. The dampness rising from the ground, the humid heaviness of the air even in winter, the lingering smell of decay drifting between the narrow streets. Visitors described a scent so strong, so deeply rooted in the soil and buildings, that it clung to their clothes long after they had left the area. The 5 Points had been built upon a buried problem on top of the old Collect Pond, a body of water that had once been a source of clean drinking water. Over time, it became polluted by industry, filled in with garbage and earth, and built over rapidly without thought to long-term consequences. By the 1850s, the land remained unstable. Beneath the neighborhood, the ground shifted and sank, leaving tenements on skewed foundations and creating pockets where standing water collected endlessly. These puddles mixed with sewage leaking from cracked pipes, with refuse tossed from windows, with runoff from slaughterhouses and stables, forming a toxic brew that spread disease faster than any doctor could treat it. Cholera, typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis each moved through the neighborhood like a silent marching army. When a disease arrived, it rarely remained isolated. Entire households fell ill within days. In a single room where 10 people slept, one coughing child could infect everyone by morning.